In Columbus, Ohio, 25 patients died under the care of Dr. William Husel, a critical care physician once trusted to save lives. Instead, he prescribed lethal doses of fentanyl, transforming a place of healing into a scene of quiet horror. This is the story of an evil doctor's deadly betrayal. In the heart of Columbus, Ohio, between 2015 and 2018, Mount Carmel Health System was home to one of the most disturbing medical cases in recent American history. At the center of it all was Dr. William Scott Husel, a critical care physician in his early 40s. On paper, he was highly qualified, respected, and trusted to care for the sickest patients in the hospital. In reality, his name would soon be tied to accusations of being one of the most prolific killers ever charged in the medical field. Dr. Husel was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He pursued medicine with determination, eventually specializing in critical care. By the time he joined Mount Carmel Health in Columbus, he had become known as a doctor who could handle the toughest cases, patients hooked up to ventilators, relying on machines and medications to survive even a few more days. The intensive care unit was his world, and he carried the kind of authority that comes with life-or-death decision-making. Mount Carmel was a respected Catholic hospital system, trusted by families across the city. The intensive care unit, or ICU, where Husel worked, was a place where patients came in at their weakest moments. Many of them were older adults, already fighting chronic conditions. Their families leaned heavily on the doctors and nurses, placing faith in their expertise. Within those walls, people expected compassion, honesty, and above all, safety. The story began quietly, without alarms or headlines. Patients came into the ICU for serious treatment. Some survived, but others died sooner than expected. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Critical care patients often died, despite the best efforts of doctors and nurses. What no one realized was that a pattern was forming, one that would later shock both medical professionals and the public. Dr. Husel had a particular approach to managing end-of-life care. He often prescribed fentanyl, a powerful opioid many times stronger than morphine. In small, carefully measured doses, fentanyl is a standard tool for reducing pain. It is common in surgical settings and intensive care. But in the records of Mount Carmel, investigators would later find something that stood out. Husel was prescribing doses far higher than what any guidelines would recommend. Typical medical practice might involve 50 to 100 micrograms of fentanyl to ease severe pain. Yet Husel's orders sometimes called for 500, 1,000, even 2,000 micrograms at once. To put that into perspective, such doses were not meant to comfort patients. They were enough to stop breathing within minutes. These prescriptions were not hidden. They were entered into the hospital system, approved by pharmacists and administered by nurses. But because doctors in critical care carry such authority, few questioned the orders at first. The patients who received these massive doses were not a single type. They were men and women, mostly older adults, but also middle-aged patients who still had families hoping for recovery. Some were in their 70s or 80s, already fragile. Others were younger, facing difficult illnesses, but not necessarily beyond saving. What united them was the suddenness of their deaths after being treated by Husel. Families began to notice. One moment, a patient would be stable enough to talk or breathe with assistance. Hours later, after medication, the patient would be gone. Loved ones were told it was natural, that their bodies had simply given up. But the timing raised doubts for some. A few family members quietly wondered whether something more had happened behind the scenes. Inside the hospital, some nurses started feeling uneasy. These were professionals trained to care for patients, and they understood pain management. But the doses they were preparing and giving on Husel's orders were unlike anything they had seen before. A nurse might glance at an order for 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl and pause. Why such a high dose for someone already weak? Nurses are trained to trust doctors, but questions began to circulate among the staff. By 2018, whispers turned into formal concerns. Pharmacists flagged prescriptions as unusual. Hospital administrators were notified. The numbers didn't make sense. Why would a physician give 10 times, even 20 times, the normal maximum? Mount Carmel's leadership launched an internal review. What they found was deeply troubling. Over a period of 3 years, dozens of patients had received dangerous levels of fentanyl under Husel's care. At this stage, the situation was not yet public. Within the walls of the hospital, administrators faced a terrible realization. If the evidence held true, they had a doctor on staff who might be deliberately causing deaths. Suspending him quietly was the first step. But the scope of the problem could not be ignored. For many years, the line between easing suffering and hastening death has been debated in medicine. Doctors practicing palliative care are sometimes faced with heartbreaking choices. Giving pain medication may shorten life by hours or days, but it can prevent unbearable suffering. Husel's defense would later rest on this principle. But what the investigation revealed went far beyond any accepted medical reasoning. Experts agreed. A single dose of 500 micrograms or more of fentanyl had no justification. It was not comfort care. It was fatal. The turning point in this story came when the hospital realized it was not dealing with a handful of questionable cases, but with a pattern. At least 25 patients had died under suspiciously similar circumstances. The record showed repeated instances of orders written by the same physician for dosages no other doctor would have approved. The scale of it forced Mount Carmel to involve law enforcement. In late 2018, Dr. Husel was officially removed from duty. Nurses and pharmacists who had worked with him were interviewed. Families of patients were contacted, some of them learning for the first time that their loved ones had been given doses far beyond what was safe. The truth was beginning to surface, and it was devastating. By early 2019, police and prosecutors were preparing charges. The story broke in the media, sending shockwaves across Ohio and the country. A respected physician, once trusted with the most fragile lives, was accused of murder on a scale rarely seen in American hospitals. For the families, the realization was almost too much to bear. They had sat by hospital beds, holding the hands of parents, spouses, and siblings, believing they were receiving compassionate care. Now they were told those final moments may have been stolen, not by illness, but by the very doctor meant to protect them. The case of William Husel raised questions not only about one man's actions, but about the systems meant to safeguard patients. How could such high doses have been prescribed without being stopped? Why did it take years before administrators intervened? And how many lives were lost before anyone spoke out? These were the questions that set the stage for one of the most chilling medical trials in recent history. What began as quiet suspicions in the halls of a Columbus hospital was now a public reckoning. The world would soon learn the details of what had happened at Mount Carmel, and William Husel's name would become forever linked with a scandal that blurred the line between care and killing. When the story of Dr. William Husel began to break outside the walls of Mount Carmel Health System, it sent immediate ripples through Columbus, Ohio. What had started as private whispers in the intensive care unit was now a matter of public concern. By late 2018, the hospital had quietly suspended Husel after uncovering troubling records, but the matter could not be kept within the system. Too many families had questions, and the numbers of patients affected were too high. Mount Carmel administrators faced a scandal that threatened not only their reputation, but also the public's trust in medicine itself. Investigators dug deeper into the case files, reviewing medical records spanning from 2015 through 2018. It became clear that the issue wasn't isolated to one or two mistakes. A pattern had emerged: systematic, repeated prescriptions of fentanyl at levels so high they could only be considered lethal. For example, orders of 500 micrograms, 1,000 micrograms, or even 2,000 micrograms stood out in black and white. These were not clerical errors. They were approved and administered doses, each with a human life at the center. The hospital tried to control the damage, contacting the families of the deceased patients and disclosing that their loved ones had been given unusually high amounts of pain medication. For many, this was the first time they had heard anything other than the natural explanation for their relative's death. Shock quickly gave way to anger. Some families recalled being reassured that their loved one was comfortable, or that the end was near and the medication was meant only for easing pain. To now be told that the drugs themselves may have caused the death was a revelation that felt like betrayal. The local media picked up the story quickly, and soon national outlets followed. Reporters described the allegations against Husel as some of the most serious ever brought against a U.S. physician. Questions were raised on television, in newspapers, and online. Was this negligence, malpractice, or something far darker? A doctor intentionally ending lives under the cover of medicine? For the staff inside Mount Carmel, the case was equally unsettling. Nurses, pharmacists, and administrators were interviewed by investigators. Some nurses admitted they had felt uneasy at times but trusted Husel's authority. Others explained that they had questioned certain prescriptions, but in a fast-moving ICU environment, they feared challenging a physician who had the final say. Pharmacists had flagged doses as unusually high, but even then, the chain of command often meant the order went through. The hospital's internal policies and safeguards were now under scrutiny, raising the question of whether systemic failures allowed Husel's actions to go unchecked. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they also began speaking with medical experts who could testify to the meaning of these dosages. Specialists confirmed that fentanyl, when given in the amounts Husel ordered, had no place in accepted medical practice. The claim that the drugs were meant purely for comfort care didn't hold up when the levels were so extreme. The evidence was stacking against him, not in the form of a single error, but in dozens of cases that followed the same chilling pattern. By January 2019, the Columbus police announced their criminal investigation into Husel's actions. The hospital acknowledged that at least 25 patients had been given fatal doses of fentanyl under his care. Families who had already buried loved ones now faced a second wave of grief, this time compounded by the idea that those deaths might not have been natural at all. Civil lawsuits began piling up against both Husel and Mount Carmel Health System. Among the patients identified were people of different ages and backgrounds. Some were elderly, already suffering from terminal conditions. Others were middle-aged, dealing with severe but potentially treatable health issues. All of them shared the same fate. They were given massive, unnecessary doses of fentanyl that ended their lives abruptly. Family members stepped forward in press conferences, holding photographs and speaking about the final moments they had with their loved ones. They described the shock of hearing that what they believed was compassionate medical care may instead have been the cause of death. The investigation also looked into Husel's motives. Was he acting out of a misguided sense of mercy, believing he was sparing patients prolonged suffering? Or was there another, darker reason behind his decisions? Prosecutors argued that intent could be shown in the repetition of the acts. A single high dose might be explained away, but when dozens of patients received similar orders, the pattern pointed to deliberate choices rather than accidents. As more details became public, the case raised national debates about the boundaries of end-of-life care. Doctors across the country spoke out. Some defended the principle of double effect, where medication given to ease pain might also hasten death, but only as an unintended side effect. Others said Husel's actions were far outside any ethical or professional standard, arguing that his doses were not about comfort at all, but about cutting lives short. In June 2019, authorities took the decisive step. Dr. William Husel was arrested and charged with 25 counts of murder. Each count corresponded to one patient whose life was ended by the excessive fentanyl doses. This was one of the largest numbers of murder charges ever filed against a physician in U.S. history. Husel turned himself in, maintaining that he was innocent and that he had only acted in the best interests of his patients. The courtroom battle ahead promised to be complex. Prosecutors would need to prove not only that the doses were lethal, but that Husel intended for them to cause death. Defense attorneys were expected to argue that he was providing palliative care, easing suffering at the request of families who had accepted that their loved ones were near the end. It was a clash between two narratives, one of a doctor portrayed as a serial killer hiding behind a white coat, and another of a physician accused of murder for practicing medicine in a way he believed was compassionate. For the community in Columbus, the case was almost impossible to process. On one hand, Mount Carmel Health System had long been a trusted institution, and the idea that such a scandal could unfold inside its ICU was deeply unsettling. On the other, the charges suggested that a man sworn to protect life had instead betrayed that oath in the most devastating way. By the time Husel was indicted, public opinion had shifted firmly against him. The number of patients, the size of the doses, and the grief of the families made it difficult for many to see his actions as anything other than criminal. Still, the justice system would have to weigh the evidence carefully, separating outrage from legal fact. The trial of Dr. William Husel was one of the most highly anticipated legal battles in recent American medical history. After his arrest in 2019 on 25 counts of murder, the case moved into the courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to argue over life, death, and intent. For the families of the deceased, it was their chance to seek justice and answers. For the medical community, it was an uneasy examination of the power physicians hold over patients at their most vulnerable moments. The courtroom was filled with tension from the very beginning. Family members of the deceased patients sat in the gallery, many holding photos of their loved ones. Reporters and legal analysts filled the benches, eager to document a case that blurred the line between medicine and homicide. At the center sat William Husel, the man who had once worn a white coat and stethoscope, now dressed in a suit and shackled by accusations that he had turned the tools of healing into weapons. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They argued that Husel knowingly and deliberately prescribed fentanyl in doses so excessive that death was the only possible outcome. They presented charts and medical records showing repeated instances of orders for 500, 1,000, and even 2,000 micrograms of the drug. Expert witnesses testified that no accepted medical guideline would ever justify such amounts. These were not end-of-life comfort measures, they insisted, but fatal injections disguised as care. Prosecutors framed Husel's actions as intentional killings, carried out under the cover of medical authority. Each count of murder represented a patient, a name, and a life that ended too soon. They called family members to the stand, who described the final days of their loved ones. Many recounted being told their relative was receiving medication to keep them comfortable, only to watch as they died within minutes or hours of receiving it. The heartbreak in their voices reinforced the prosecution's argument that Husel had betrayed their trust and abused his position. On the other side, the defense team painted a very different picture. They argued that Husel was a dedicated critical care physician who never intended to kill his patients. Instead, they claimed he acted within the scope of palliative care, using his medical judgment to ensure that patients at the end of life did not suffer needlessly. They reminded the jury that many of the patients were critically ill, often with little chance of survival. Husel, they argued, made decisions based on compassion, not malice. Defense experts challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the fentanyl doses. They suggested that while the amounts were high, they were not necessarily outside the range of comfort care in extreme cases. The central question, they argued, was not the size of the dose, but the intention behind it. If Husel's intent was to relieve suffering, then the outcome, even if death followed, was not murder. They also emphasized that no patient was given medication without the family's consent for comfort measures, a point meant to blur the line between medical judgment and criminal intent. The trial stretched on, with days of testimony that delved into the complexity of medicine, ethics, and law. Jurors were asked to weigh technical explanations of dosages against emotional testimony from grieving families. The defense tried to sow doubt, pointing out that critical care medicine often involves decisions where the line between extending life and easing death is thin. The prosecution countered that this was not about gray areas, but about actions so far outside accepted practice that they could only be considered intentional. The turning point of the trial came when the jury was asked to consider not just whether the doses were high, but whether they were so high that no reasonable physician could claim they were appropriate. Prosecutors pressed the point that 500 micrograms of fentanyl or more is universally recognized as excessive. Defense attorneys responded that Husel's aim was never to hasten death, but to ensure comfort. The debate highlighted the theme that had haunted the case from the beginning: the delicate balance between care and killing. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury deliberated. Families waited anxiously for the verdict, torn between grief and the hope for justice. When the decision was read, it sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Dr. William Husel was acquitted on all counts of murder. The jury concluded that while his actions were highly unusual and controversial, the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that his intent was to kill. The verdict left many stunned. For some families, it felt like a second loss. They believed that their loved ones had been victims, yet the man accused of ending their lives was walking free. Others accepted the decision with quiet resignation, recognizing that the legal standard of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt is a high bar. For Husel, the acquittal was both a relief and the start of a new reality. Though he was cleared in criminal court, his career as a physician was effectively over. Mount Carmel had already severed ties, and his medical license was revoked. He would never again practice medicine, his name permanently linked to one of the most controversial medical cases in American history. Civil lawsuits continued, with families pursuing damages against both Husel and the hospital system, ensuring that the legal battles would not end with a criminal trial. The story of William Husel raised profound questions that extended beyond the courtroom. How should society define the limits of comfort care? At what point does easing pain cross into ending life? And perhaps most importantly, how can hospitals and oversight systems prevent such situations from happening again? Mount Carmel Health System implemented sweeping changes to its procedures, tightening safeguards on medication orders, and reviewing the role of oversight in the ICU. Yet the damage to its reputation lingered, as did the pain of families who felt betrayed. In the end, the case became a cautionary tale about trust, authority, and accountability in medicine. Husel himself maintained that he had only ever wanted to ease suffering, but the sheer scale of the allegations left a permanent mark. 25 patients, each with their own story, each with families who mourned them, became part of a larger narrative about the risks of unchecked medical power. The confession never came, because Husel insisted he had nothing to confess. The conviction never arrived, because the jury could not find the evidence of intent strong enough. The sentencing never followed, because the law did not hold him guilty. But the case left behind something perhaps just as enduring: a deep unease about the vulnerability of patients in the hands of their caregivers, and a reminder that even in the most trusted institutions, oversight can fail. The case of Dr. William Husel remains one of the most unsettling examples of how thin the line can be between compassion and crime. For the families, it will forever be a story of loved ones lost too soon. For the public, it stands as a chilling reminder of the power doctors hold and the responsibility society must demand from them. In Berlin, between 2021 and 2022, a trusted palliative care doctor quietly crossed the line between healing and harm. Behind hospital doors, 15 patients lost their lives not to illness, but to deliberate overdoses. This is the chilling story of Johannes M., a man sworn to protect, accused of murder. Berlin, the capital of Germany, is a city that carries the weight of history. Its streets have seen war, division, and rebirth. By the early 2020s, Berlin was a modern European hub, alive with energy and change. Yet beneath the surface of any city, there are always stories that remain hidden until they force their way into the light. Between 2021 and 2022, in a quiet corner of Berlin's medical world, a story began to take shape that would later shock the country. It centered on a man who, to many, represented trust and care: Dr. Johannes M. Johannes M. was in his late 40s during those years. Professionally, he was a doctor specializing in palliative care, a field of medicine dedicated to patients facing terminal illnesses. Palliative care is about easing suffering when a cure is no longer possible. It involves balancing pain relief with dignity, listening to patients, and supporting families through some of the hardest moments of their lives. Doctors in this field hold a special responsibility. They are entrusted with the most vulnerable, the elderly, the gravely ill, the people who often cannot speak for themselves. In his daily role, Johannes carried the image of a calm, competent physician. Patients and their families saw him as a man who understood suffering and who could bring relief. His workplace, a medical facility in Berlin, treated patients from across the city, many in the final stages of life. It was not unusual for death to occur in such a setting. Families expected it, though never without pain. And yet, between 2021 and 2022, deaths began to occur in ways that, at first, slipped by unnoticed. The patients under Johannes's care were mostly elderly men and women, many of them in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Some had terminal cancer, others suffered from advanced neurological disorders, and a few had severe organ failure. They were fragile people in need of careful monitoring. Families placed their trust in the clinic and in Johannes, believing their loved ones would spend their final days in dignity and comfort. But behind the image of professionalism, prosecutors would later claim, Johannes was making choices that stripped patients of that very dignity. During that year-long span, a series of 15 patients died while under his supervision. At first, nothing seemed unusual. After all, in palliative care, patients often pass away after months of declining health. But when details were later pieced together, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Several of the patients had died suddenly, within hours of receiving drug combinations that should not have been administered in those amounts. These were not the gradual passings expected in palliative care. They were abrupt and unexplained. The families of the deceased had questions, though initially, they accepted the explanations given. Medical staff told them their loved ones had deteriorated quickly. They were reassured that everything possible had been done to provide comfort. Most families had no reason to doubt this. Death was always near in a palliative ward. Yet as time went on, suspicions began to surface. Nurses noticed irregularities in the dosages recorded. Some colleagues questioned why certain patients, who had been stable just hours earlier, had suddenly collapsed. According to prosecutors, Johannes had administered lethal combinations of drugs without consent. The drugs in question were medications commonly available in palliative settings: opioids, sedatives, and other powerful substances. In the right doses, they calmed pain and eased breathing. In higher amounts, they stopped breathing altogether. The line between relief and death in such medicine is thin, and it requires strict monitoring. Prosecutors argued that Johannes knowingly crossed that line. His alleged actions were not only hidden behind medical charts, but, as evidence would later show, there were attempts to cover tracks. Records appeared altered, dosages went unreported, and in some cases, files were missing key entries. This gave the impression of chaos or oversight, but investigators later claimed it pointed to deliberate tampering. For a long time, the deaths blended into the rhythm of the clinic, seen as tragic but natural. What remained constant was the trust placed in Johannes. Families looked to him for reassurance. Colleagues described him as composed, not the kind of doctor who attracted suspicion. Patients, too weak to speak for themselves, had no voice to raise concerns. This combination of silence and trust gave Johannes the space he allegedly used to carry out his actions. By early 2022, the number of sudden deaths under his care could no longer be ignored. A nurse raised her concerns to a supervisor after noticing inconsistencies in how certain medications had been logged. The nurse, whose name was not publicly released due to privacy, noticed that patients who had not been scheduled for strong sedatives were nonetheless receiving them in large amounts. This detail stood out. Normally, in palliative medicine, dosages were carefully coordinated and always approved. To see such irregularities sparked questions that would eventually reach administrators. From there, the situation shifted. The clinic began an internal review, quietly examining charts, drug supplies, and staff reports. What they found was unsettling. Multiple patient files showed the same signs. Large doses of opioids, often in combination with sedatives, had been given shortly before death. Not only were these dosages high, they were far beyond what guidelines allowed. The same doctor's name appeared again and again, Johannes M. At this stage, the case had not yet reached the public. Inside the clinic, administrators wrestled with what to do. They knew accusing a doctor of misconduct, let alone something as serious as intentional killing, would ignite a scandal. But the evidence was enough that law enforcement had to be notified. The files were handed over, and a criminal investigation began. Police in Berlin opened a case in mid-2022. They examined records, interviewed staff, and began reconstructing the final days of the patients who had died. Families were contacted. Some of them, for the first time, told that their relatives' deaths might not have been natural. The shock for those families was immense. They had grieved, buried their loved ones, and moved on as best they could. To suddenly learn that those deaths might have been caused by deliberate action reopened wounds they thought had healed. For investigators, the task was complex. Proving intent in medical cases is notoriously difficult. Doctors have wide discretion in prescribing medications, and mistakes can happen. But the repeated pattern of lethal doses, the alleged attempts to alter records, and the high number of deaths created a picture that was hard to dismiss. As the investigation progressed, the scope widened, uncovering more patients whose deaths fit the same pattern. By late 2022, prosecutors believed they had enough to charge Johannes M. He was accused of murdering 15 patients in total, all between 2021 and 2022. Each case was tied to the same method: lethal drug combinations given without consent, often disguised as routine care. Alongside these charges, he faced allegations of attempting to destroy or manipulate evidence to conceal his actions. For Berlin, and for Germany as a whole, the story was deeply unsettling. The role of a palliative care doctor is one of profound responsibility. These are professionals entrusted with easing life's most painful final moments. To see that role allegedly turned into one of exploitation was more than a breach of law. It was a betrayal of the most basic human trust. The trial would not begin until 2025, but by the time Johannes was charged, the story had already taken hold in public discussion. Families wanted answers. Medical professionals debated what had gone wrong and how warning signs had been missed. The idea that one man could act unchecked for so long raised questions about oversight, accountability, and the safeguards of the healthcare system. The investigation into Johannes M. moved slowly, but with growing certainty. Once suspicions were raised in 2022, police in Berlin began the painstaking work of gathering enough evidence to take the case forward. In Germany, as in many countries, accusing a doctor of killing patients requires more than suspicion. Investigators needed patterns, proof, and testimony that could stand up in court. Over the course of months, they dug through records, examined medicine cabinets, and interviewed anyone who had worked alongside Johannes. One of the key challenges was the nature of palliative care itself. Patients in these wards were already critically ill. Many were at the very end of their lives. Natural death was expected, and so sudden changes in condition did not always spark alarm. Investigators had to look closely at the medical charts, not to determine if the patients should have died, but if they had died earlier than they should have. The distinction was subtle but critical. Toxicology reports played an important role. Exhumations were carried out in several cases where families gave permission. Samples from preserved tissue revealed levels of opioids and sedatives that exceeded therapeutic ranges. These findings strengthened the suspicion that the patients had not died naturally, but rather from drug overdoses. In one case, an elderly woman in her 70s had shown signs of improvement in her pain management plan. She had been stable, eating lightly, and speaking with her daughter. Yet just hours after receiving medication from Johannes, she was found unresponsive. When samples from her remains were analyzed later, the dosage levels were far beyond what would have been prescribed. Alongside the scientific evidence, investigators turned to staff testimony. Nurses recalled moments when Johannes had taken control of administering medication, sometimes insisting that he alone would handle a patient's pain relief. While unusual, most staff had not challenged him at the time. He was, after all, a doctor. Questioning his choices felt inappropriate in a medical hierarchy. It was only when they compared notes during the investigation that they realized how many had noticed the same pattern. Another detail that emerged was Johannes's handling of paperwork. Medical records are central to patient care. Every dose, every change in condition must be logged. Yet in case after case, investigators found missing entries or corrections written in after the fact. Sometimes doses were written down hours later, raising questions about accuracy. On a few occasions, pages were missing altogether. While this might have been explained as poor record-keeping, combined with the toxicology results, it pointed toward deliberate tampering. By late 2022, the case against Johannes was strong enough that prosecutors began preparing formal charges. But before they could proceed, they had to build a timeline of his actions across all the deaths. 15 patients, all elderly, all vulnerable, all dead within a span of roughly 12 months. Each case had its own tragedy. Families who had said goodbye without knowing the full story were now being told that their relatives' deaths were not just inevitable, but possibly forced. The grief returned sharper than before. In interviews, some family members described their experiences. A son in his 50s recalled visiting his father, who had late-stage cancer but was still alert and able to speak. He remembered leaving the hospital after what seemed like an ordinary visit, only to be called back the next morning with news that his father had passed. At the time, he believed the decline had been sudden but natural. Later, when police contacted him, he learned that his father had been one of Johannes's patients. For him, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. For investigators, the turning point in their work came when they were able to establish consistency across the cases. Each patient had received unusually high doses of similar drug combinations. Each dose had been administered or overseen by Johannes. And in nearly every case, the medical records showed irregularities. What had once seemed like a series of natural deaths now looked like a clear pattern of deliberate action. The wider medical community reacted with disbelief. In professional circles, Johannes had not been a figure of controversy. He was not known for disputes, scandals, or even unusual behavior outside his work. Colleagues described him as quiet, reserved, and dedicated. That image clashed with the growing portrait investigators were drawing. If the charges were true, then Johannes had been operating in silence, hidden by the very system meant to ensure care. In 2023, the scope of the investigation expanded further. Authorities wanted to be certain they understood the full extent of Johannes's actions. They reviewed dozens of additional deaths during his tenure, checking for any signs that they, too, had been accelerated. While the focus remained on the 15 confirmed cases, the possibility of more could not be ruled out. The families of other former patients waited anxiously, fearing that their loved ones might also have been victims. As the evidence mounted, Johannes was eventually arrested. His detention was a quiet affair, carried out without spectacle, but news quickly reached the public. German media began reporting on the story, and it spread rapidly. Headlines described a palliative care doctor accused of ending lives without consent. For many, it was shocking not only for the crime itself, but for the setting in which it had occurred. Hospitals and clinics are places of safety. The idea that a doctor had turned them into places of danger struck a deep nerve. Public reaction grew intense. Commentators debated whether the system had failed in its oversight. Politicians spoke of reviewing regulations in palliative care. Advocacy groups for patients and the elderly demanded stronger protections. Families of the deceased appeared in interviews, sharing their pain and confusion. Some spoke of guilt, wondering if they had missed signs or should have asked more questions. But most of all, they wanted answers, and they wanted justice. Throughout this period, Johannes maintained a guarded silence. While under questioning, he did not admit wrongdoing. His lawyers argued that the deaths were the natural outcome of severe illnesses. They claimed that his medical decisions, while perhaps aggressive in pain management, had been within reason. But the weight of toxicology results, altered records, and testimony painted a darker picture. By early 2024, prosecutors confirmed that the case would go to trial. 15 counts of murder, plus charges of attempting to destroy evidence. It was one of the most serious cases against a medical professional in modern German history. Preparations for the trial were extensive. Each patient's case would be presented, each family given a chance to be heard. Expert witnesses were called to explain the medical details, how much of a drug was safe, how much was lethal, and how those lines had been crossed. The upcoming trial stirred national debate. Some argued that the case highlighted a need for clearer boundaries between palliative care and assisted dying, a subject already sensitive in Germany. Others insisted that this was not a matter of blurred lines, but of deliberate crime. To them, Johannes was not a doctor navigating ethical complexity, but a man who had chosen to kill. As 2025 approached, the weight of the case hung heavy over Berlin. For families, the waiting was difficult. They had lost loved ones years earlier, and now they had to face the prospect of reliving those final days in court. For the medical community, the case served as a chilling reminder of what can happen when trust is broken. And for prosecutors, it was the task of proving beyond doubt that Johannes had turned from healer to killer. The trial of Johannes M. opened in Berlin in early 2025. By the time the case reached court, the story was already known across Germany. The quiet palliative care doctor accused of killing 15 patients had become a symbol of broken trust. Reporters filled the courtroom. Families of the victims sat in silence, and prosecutors began laying out the evidence piece by piece. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind that comes when the truth of private suffering is brought into public view. Each of the 15 cases was presented in detail. Prosecutors described the lives of the patients, their conditions, and their final days. They explained how many of them had been fragile but stable before sudden declines. Expert witnesses walked the court through toxicology results, showing how the levels of opioids and sedatives in their systems far exceeded therapeutic ranges. Charts and graphs were displayed, each line of data making the same point. These patients had been given more than medicine for pain. They had been given doses capable of shutting down their lungs and hearts. Family members testified about their experiences. A daughter in her 40s recalled visiting her mother the night before she died. Her mother had been weak, but still able to talk, even managing a faint smile. Hours later, she was gone. At the time, the daughter had accepted the explanation that her mother's illness had advanced quickly. Now she sat in court, describing the confusion and anger she felt after learning the truth. Another relative, a son in his 60s, spoke about his father's sudden collapse, saying he had trusted Johannes completely. "We never doubted him," he said quietly, "and that is what makes it so hard to understand." The nurses who had raised early concerns also appeared as witnesses. They described Johannes's control over medication administration and the irregularities in his paperwork. One nurse explained how she had noticed doses being given without prior approval, sometimes late at night when fewer staff were on duty. Another described the unease she felt when patients who seemed stable would suddenly deteriorate after Johannes had been in their rooms. For many of these nurses, testifying was difficult. They had once respected him, and some still struggled with guilt, wondering if they should have spoken out sooner. The defense argued that Johannes had acted within his role as a palliative care doctor. His lawyers claimed that end-of-life medicine often required difficult choices and high dosages to relieve unbearable pain. They pointed out that death was inevitable in each case, and that there was no clear proof that the drugs alone had caused it. They suggested that errors in record-keeping or the natural course of illness might explain what happened. They tried to frame Johannes as a man caught in the impossible balance of providing comfort while confronting death. But the evidence was difficult to dismiss. Prosecutors showed patterns. The same types of drugs, the same dosages beyond accepted guidelines, the same lack of consent from patients or families. They pointed to altered records and missing entries. They highlighted how these deaths clustered under Johannes's supervision, while other doctors in the clinic did not show such irregularities. Slowly, a picture formed not of a doctor struggling with ethical boundaries, but of one who had crossed them entirely. The turning point in the trial came when investigators revealed that Johannes himself had admitted, during a private interrogation months earlier, that he had gone beyond what was allowed. While not a full confession at the time, those words suggested awareness of wrongdoing. In court, under pressure and facing the weight of evidence, Johannes finally spoke. His statement was not long, but it was enough to confirm the suspicions that had haunted families for years. He admitted to administering doses that were lethal. He admitted that he had done so without asking patients or families. His reasoning was unclear, wavering between claims of easing suffering and vague explanations about control. What was clear was that he had crossed the line deliberately. The courtroom was silent as he spoke. For the families, the confession brought a mixture of emotions. Some wept quietly, others sat rigid, their grief sharpened by the confirmation. For prosecutors, it sealed the case. The defense could no longer argue that the deaths were natural or unintended. The man at the center of the case had admitted his role. The conviction followed. The court found Johannes guilty of 15 counts of murder and of attempting to destroy evidence. The judge described his actions as a grave betrayal of medical duty, a crime that had not only taken lives, but had shaken public trust in healthcare. The sentencing was severe, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. In Germany, such a sentence is rare and reserved for the most serious crimes. For Johannes, it meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The reaction to the sentencing was strong. Families expressed relief that justice had been served, though many admitted that no sentence could undo what had been done. Some said they could finally grieve properly, knowing the truth had been revealed. Others said they would never forgive him. For the medical community, the case became a warning. Hospitals and clinics across Germany reviewed their oversight practices, looking for ways to prevent similar breaches. Discussions about palliative care, assisted dying, and medical ethics intensified, with many insisting that clearer safeguards were needed. In the weeks after the verdict, commentators reflected on the deeper meaning of the case. It was not simply about one man's crimes. It was about the fragile line between care and harm, and the importance of accountability in professions built on trust. Johannes had been given authority over the most vulnerable people, and he had used that authority not to comfort, but to kill. His actions left scars not only on the families of the 15 patients, but on the broader sense of security people felt in the medical system. For Berlin, the story became part of its modern history, a reminder that even in places of healing, darkness can exist. For Germany, it sparked debate about how doctors should be monitored and how patients can be better protected. For the families, it was the end of a long and painful journey, one that began with unanswered questions in 2021 and ended in a courtroom 4 years later. The story of Johannes M. is one of betrayal and justice. It began in the quiet wards of a palliative care clinic, where trust was absolute. It unfolded through suspicion, investigation, and evidence that could not be ignored. And it concluded in a courtroom where the truth was finally spoken, and a man who once wore the coat of a healer was judged as a murderer. The lessons it leaves behind are harsh but necessary, that trust must always be guarded, that oversight must never be weak, and that even those who seem dedicated to care can, in rare and terrible cases, use that power to harm. A celebrated surgeon once promised miracles with stem cell windpipes, hailed as the future of medicine. Instead, his patients died one by one. This is the story of Paolo Macchiarini, a man whose ambition crossed into deception, and how hope turned into one of modern medicine's darkest scandals. In the late 2000s, the world of medicine was brimming with optimism. Advances in stem cell research were beginning to capture the imagination of scientists and the public alike. The idea that damaged organs could be repaired or even replaced by using a patient's own cells seemed almost within reach. At the center of this hopeful vision was an Italian thoracic surgeon named Paolo Macchiarini. Born in Switzerland in 1958 to Italian parents and raised in Italy, he built his reputation in Europe as a talented and ambitious doctor. By 2010, he was recruited to Sweden's prestigious Karolinska Institute, a place renowned not only for cutting-edge research, but also for its close ties to the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Macchiarini was no ordinary surgeon. He carried himself with confidence, often described by colleagues as charming, persuasive, and unafraid to take risks. To his patients and their families, he seemed like a savior, offering hope where none existed. His specialty was thoracic surgery, operations on the chest, lungs, and trachea. The trachea or windpipe is a vital but fragile organ. When it is severely damaged by cancer, trauma, or congenital defects, there are few options. Traditional transplants are almost impossible because suitable donor tracheas are scarce and rejection rates are high. Macchiarini claimed to have a solution that bypassed these problems. His idea was to create synthetic windpipes, or to use biological scaffolds from donor trachea's stripped cells, then coat them with stem cells taken from the patient's own bone marrow. In theory, these stem cells would grow into living tissue, forming a new, functioning airway. To patients who had no other chance of survival, this sounded like a miracle. To universities and hospitals, it looked like groundbreaking science that could place them at the forefront of regenerative medicine. In June 2011, the world's first synthetic trachea transplant took place at Karolinska University Hospital in Stockholm. The patient was Andemariam Tekelsembet Bayene, a 36-year-old doctoral student from Eritrea, living in Iceland with his young family. Bayene had advanced cancer of the windpipe, and no standard surgery could save him. Facing certain death, he agreed to the experimental procedure. Macchiarini implanted a windpipe scaffold made from plastic, seeded with Bayene's own stem cells. For a moment, it seemed like success. International media reported the surgery as a breakthrough. The Karolinska Institute proudly highlighted it as proof that their surgeon was pushing medicine into a new era. Bayene became a symbol of hope, the man whose life had been extended by science. But inside the hospital, doubts were already stirring. Other surgeons and doctors noticed problems almost immediately. Bayene's new windpipe did not behave like living tissue. It did not integrate with his body as promised. He struggled with infections, breathing difficulties, and repeated hospitalizations. Over the next 3 years, his health declined until he died in January 2014. What had been hailed as a miracle began to look like a tragic experiment. Despite these warning signs, Macchiarini pressed forward. Later in 2011, he performed another operation on Yulia Tulik, a Russian woman in her 30s who had suffered severe trachea damage after a car accident. Like Bayene, she was desperate for a solution. She received a similar synthetic implant. Within months, her condition worsened. The artificial windpipe degraded, caused severe infections, and failed to support her airway. She underwent repeated surgeries, none of which restored her health. She died not long afterward. The following year, Macchiarini performed more of these procedures, in both Sweden and Russia. His patients came from different backgrounds, but most were young or middle-aged adults who were told this was their only chance at survival. Some were cancer patients, others had traumatic injuries, and one was a child. Among them was Hannah Warren, a 2-year-old girl born in South Korea without a trachea. She had lived her short life in a hospital in Seoul, kept alive by a tube. In 2013, her case caught the attention of American doctors who invited Macchiarini to perform surgery in the United States. The operation took place at Children's Hospital of Illinois. Hannah received a synthetic windpipe, but her body could not handle the complications. She died 3 months later, never leaving the hospital. In total, between 2010 and 2014, Macchiarini operated on 8 patients using synthetic or biologically engineered tracheas. 7 of them died. The only survivor was left with lasting health issues, living with constant medical complications. To outsiders, Macchiarini continued to present his work as a success. He published papers describing the operations in respected medical journals. He gave interviews highlighting the promise of regenerative medicine. Institutions that supported him basked in the publicity. But behind the curtain, his colleagues were alarmed. Surgeons at the Karolinska Institute saw their patients suffering. Nurses witnessed the daily struggles. Questions grew louder. Were these operations truly safe, or were they reckless experiments carried out on vulnerable people? For the patients and their families, the reality was brutal. They had trusted a renowned doctor at one of the world's top medical centers. They believed they were receiving cutting-edge care backed by science. Instead, they endured painful surgeries, long hospitalizations, and ultimately death. Families grieved not only their loss, but also the betrayal of hope. By 2014, the results were impossible to ignore. One after another, the patients who had been promised a second chance at life were gone. What began as a story of medical innovation was turning into a story of tragedy and deception. Yet, Macchiarini maintained his confidence. He insisted the deaths were due to the severity of the patient's illnesses, not flaws in the treatment. He defended his methods as necessary risks in the search for progress. And for a time, many in the medical establishment accepted his explanations. Still, the cracks in his reputation were beginning to show. Doctors at Karolinska and elsewhere quietly raised concerns about the lack of scientific evidence. They noted that the synthetic windpipes did not function like real tissue, that there was no proof stem cells had regenerated anything. Reports began to circulate that Macchiarini had exaggerated his results, downplayed complications, and misled both patients and colleagues. The story was far from over. In those early years, between 2010 and 2014, Paolo Macchiarini appeared to the world as a daring pioneer, willing to take bold steps where others hesitated. But behind the headlines and the staged photographs of smiling patients, a darker truth was unfolding. His patients were dying, their families were shattered, and the medical community was left to question whether they were witnessing a revolution or a reckless gamble with human lives. By the middle of the decade, whispers about Paolo Macchiarini's work had grown louder. Inside the Karolinska Institute, where he held a coveted position, colleagues were deeply unsettled by what they were seeing. Patients were not recovering as he claimed. Reports in his published papers did not match the clinical reality staff observed on the wards. Some doctors noticed that complications were understated or entirely absent from his accounts. For a while, their concerns stayed within the walls of the hospital. The Karolinska Institute was proud of its star surgeon and reluctant to damage its reputation. But slowly, what had begun as quiet doubts turned into open suspicion. Among the first to challenge him were fellow physicians who worked directly with the patients he had operated on. They saw the suffering firsthand, tracheas collapsing, infections recurring, patients tethered to machines. Several doctors documented the discrepancies between what was happening and what Macchiarini was reporting to journals and colleagues. In 2014, 4 physicians at Karolinska filed a formal complaint. They accused him of falsifying his research and misrepresenting the outcomes of his surgeries. These doctors, respected professionals in their own right, took a serious risk in speaking out against such a celebrated figure. They knew the Institute's reputation was on the line, and exposing him could bring massive consequences. Initially, the response from Karolinska was hesitant. Macchiarini's position was not only prestigious, but also politically sensitive. The institute was tied to the Nobel Assembly, which awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. To admit that one of their own had engaged in misconduct could taint the credibility of the entire organization. As a result, the complaint was quietly dismissed, and Macchiarini continued to work, shielded by the aura of innovation. For the moment, his star still shone brightly, though cracks were widening beneath the surface. While the medical community debated internally, the story began to draw attention from outside. Investigative journalists in Sweden started digging into his research. In 2016, Swedish public television aired a 3-part documentary series titled Experimenten, or The Experiments. The program revealed the shocking truth. Patients had been misled into thinking the synthetic trachea procedures were safe, when in reality, they were untested and highly dangerous. The series showed interviews with family members who had lost loved ones. It exposed how the patients had become test subjects in operations that were closer to experiments than genuine treatments. The broadcast shook Sweden and reverberated throughout the medical world. The documentary painted a devastating picture of a doctor willing to gamble with human lives in pursuit of fame and recognition. It also exposed how the institutions around him had enabled his actions. Karolinska, rather than stopping him when concerns first arose, had allowed him to keep operating, eager to protect its own image as a world-leading medical center. The story was no longer a matter of quiet whispers within hospital walls. It had become a public scandal. At the same time, more details about Macchiarini's personal life surfaced, adding to the sense that something was profoundly wrong. A high-profile scandal erupted when it was revealed that he had been engaged to an American television producer who believed they were planning a glamorous wedding officiated by the Pope and attended by celebrities like the Obamas and the Clintons. None of it was true. The relationship collapsed when the elaborate lies came to light, further tarnishing his reputation. To the public, this personal deceit mirrored his professional misconduct, a pattern of charm, promises, and falsehoods. As these revelations emerged, the scientific community began reassessing Macchiarini's legacy. His published research was scrutinized. Colleagues found inconsistencies and questionable claims. There was little evidence that stem cells had ever regenerated functional tissue in the tracheas he implanted. Instead, the scaffolds, whether synthetic plastic tubes or stripped-down donor tracheas, were breaking down inside patients' bodies. They became sources of infection and inflammation rather than lifelines. What he had presented as groundbreaking regenerative medicine was, in fact, an illusion. The impact of the scandal was enormous. Families of patients demanded answers. They had trusted the Karolinska Institute and its surgeon, only to lose loved ones in painful and drawn-out deaths. The medical community was forced to ask difficult questions about how such experiments had been allowed to proceed. How could a surgeon perform multiple high-risk operations without solid evidence? Why had ethical oversight failed? And why had institutions chosen to protect their reputation instead of their patients? Internationally, the fallout spread. In Russia, where Macchiarini had also performed surgeries, similar doubts surfaced about how patients were recruited and treated. In the United States, the death of 2-year-old Hannah Warren became part of the discussion, raising questions about why a child had been subjected to such a dangerous and unproven procedure. Hospitals that had once celebrated their association with him now distanced themselves. The image of the daring pioneer had been replaced by that of a reckless operator. As pressure mounted, the Karolinska Institute could no longer defend him. By early 2016, following the Swedish documentary and mounting criticism from the medical community, he was dismissed from his position. The institute acknowledged that serious mistakes had been made and that oversight had failed. Several leaders at Karolinska resigned in the wake of the scandal, an extraordinary step that showed the damage done to one of the most respected medical institutions in the world. Meanwhile, the legal consequences were beginning to catch up with him. Authorities in Sweden launched investigations into his conduct. The question was not only whether his research was fraudulent, but also whether his actions amounted to a crime. Families of patients demanded justice, arguing that their loved ones had been used as test subjects without proper consent or safeguards. The Swedish police opened a case to determine whether the surgeon's actions constituted assault, manslaughter, or worse. The scandal also ignited a broader debate in medicine about the limits of innovation. Surgeons and scientists are often under pressure to push boundaries, to be first, to achieve breakthroughs that change lives. But the case of Paolo Macchiarini highlighted what can happen when ambition overshadows caution. Innovation without evidence, oversight, or ethics can quickly turn into tragedy. The patients he operated on were not test subjects in a laboratory. They were people who trusted him with their lives. And that trust had been broken in the most devastating way. By the end of 2016, the world's view of Paolo Macchiarini had completely shifted. Once seen as a hero of regenerative medicine, he was now regarded as a symbol of hubris and deceit. His operations, once touted as miracles, were now recognized as catastrophic failures. The families who had believed in him were left with grief and betrayal. The institutions that had supported him were left with damaged reputations. And the medical community was left with hard lessons about ethics, oversight, and the dangers of chasing glory at the expense of safety. Still, the story was not over. The final chapter would unfold in courtrooms, where the question would be asked directly. Was Paolo Macchiarini merely a misguided pioneer who took risks in the name of progress, or was he a criminal who knowingly harmed patients under the guise of science? The truth and justice for the victims would only come in the years ahead. By the time Paolo Macchiarini was dismissed from the Karolinska Institute in 2016, the tide had fully turned against him. What had once been celebrated as groundbreaking science was now condemned as reckless experimentation. His name, once associated with hope and innovation, had become synonymous with scandal. But the question remained: would there be real accountability? Families who had lost loved ones wanted more than apologies or institutional reforms. They wanted justice. The story of Paolo Macchiarini was no longer just about failed surgeries and flawed science. It was about criminal responsibility. The legal process began slowly. Swedish authorities launched a criminal investigation to determine whether Macchiarini's actions crossed into the realm of assault, manslaughter, or even murder. The challenge was significant. In medicine, risk is an unavoidable part of treatment. Surgeons often make decisions under pressure, weighing life and death in the operating room. Defense attorneys could argue that Macchiarini had been trying to save lives, not endanger them. But prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that he had deliberately misrepresented the safety of his procedures, performing dangerous surgeries without scientific evidence to support them. And in doing so, he had subjected vulnerable patients to immense harm. Investigators reviewed the cases of the 8 patients who had undergone the experimental trachea transplants between 2010 and 2014. They focused particularly on 3 of them: Andemariam Tekelsenbet-Bayene, the 36-year-old doctoral student from Eritrea; Yulia Tulik, the Russian woman in her 30s who had been injured in a car accident; and a 3rd patient from Turkey who had also died after undergoing the surgery. In each case, prosecutors argued Macchiarini had gone ahead with a high-risk, unproven operation while assuring patients and families that it was safe and viable. The results had been devastating. Instead of extending lives, the procedures had led to prolonged suffering and premature death. The courtroom proceedings were intense. Families of the patients spoke about their loss, about the hope they had been given, and the pain of watching their loved ones deteriorate after the surgeries. Doctors testified about what they had seen in the wards: synthetic windpipes breaking down inside patients' bodies, repeated infections, collapsed airways, and desperate attempts to save patients who never stood a chance. Medical experts described how there had never been solid evidence that stem cells could regenerate functional tracheas. What Macchiarini had promised was, in their words, a fantasy. Prosecutors painted him as a man driven by ambition, willing to sacrifice human lives for personal glory. Macchiarini's defense rested on the claim that he had been working at the cutting edge of science, that the patients were out of options, and that he had offered them the only chance at survival. His lawyers argued that desperate situations called for desperate measures, and that the patients had given their consent, fully aware of the risks. To the defense, this was not a crime, but a tragedy of medical innovation gone wrong. To the families and prosecutors, however, it was deception at the highest level, and the surgeon should be held accountable for crossing the line between risk and recklessness. In 2022, after years of investigations and hearings, the Swedish court reached its verdict. Paolo Macchiarini was convicted of aggravated assault. The court found that he had knowingly performed experimental surgeries without sufficient evidence, that he had falsely presented them as safe, and that he had inflicted serious bodily harm on his patients. However, he was not convicted of murder or manslaughter. The court ruled that while his actions caused suffering and accelerated the deaths of his patients, it could not be proven beyond doubt that the operations alone had directly caused their deaths, since the patients were already gravely ill. For many, this distinction was frustrating. To the families who had lost loved ones, it felt like justice had only been half served. The sentence was handed down in June 2023. Macchiarini was given a prison term of 2 years and 6 months. For a man whose actions had contributed to the deaths of multiple patients, the punishment seemed light. But in the world of medical law, it was an extraordinary outcome. Very few doctors are ever criminally convicted for their surgical decisions, even when the results are catastrophic. The case set a precedent, showing that the shield of medical authority does not protect against accountability when deception and negligence are involved. The conviction also cast a long shadow over the Karolinska Institute and the medical establishment at large. The scandal had already forced the resignation of several leaders at Karolinska, but the damage to its reputation endured. Questions about oversight, ethics, and institutional responsibility continued to surface. How had one surgeon been able to perform such dangerous operations without sufficient scrutiny? Why had early warnings been ignored? The answers pointed to a culture of prestige and ambition, where the desire to be seen as pioneering overshadowed the duty to protect patients. For an institution so closely tied to the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the scandal was particularly damaging. It highlighted how even the most respected centers of science are vulnerable to the dangers of hubris and poor oversight. For the medical community worldwide, the case became a cautionary tale. It underscored the importance of ethics committees, transparent research, and rigorous testing before experimental treatments are offered to patients. It reminded doctors and researchers that innovation must never outpace evidence. Patients are not test subjects, and hope must not be traded for reckless ambition. The story of Paolo Macchiarini illustrated, in devastating detail, what happens when those lines are crossed. For the families, the pain remains. Andamariam Tekelsenbit-Bayene's widow spoke publicly about how her husband had been used as an experiment rather than treated as a patient. The family of little Hannah Warren remember the promise of a miracle that ended in heartbreak. Relatives of Yulia Tulik described the suffering she endured before her death. Their stories became central to the narrative, ensuring that the victims were not forgotten in the shadow of the scandal. As for Macchiarini himself, he remains a divisive figure. To his defenders, he is a visionary who went too far, punished for trying to push the boundaries of science. To his critics, he is a fraud who put lives at risk for personal fame. The courts have spoken, but the debate over his legacy continues. What is clear is that his once bright career has been destroyed, his reputation ruined, and his name forever linked to one of the darkest scandals in modern medicine. Looking back at the years between 2010 and 2014, it is difficult to reconcile the two images of Paolo Macchiarini. On one hand, there was the celebrated surgeon, hailed as a pioneer of regenerative medicine, promising to save lives with cutting-edge science. On the other, there was the reckless operator, performing dangerous surgeries without evidence, leaving a trail of suffering and death. The world first saw the hero. It took years of investigation, journalism, and courtroom battles to reveal the villain. The case of Paolo Macchiarini is not just the story of one surgeon. It is a story about the power of institutions, the vulnerability of patients, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. It is about how hope can be manipulated, how trust can be betrayed, and how even the most prestigious centers of science can fail in their responsibility to protect those who come to them for help. It is a reminder that medical progress must be built not only on innovation, but also on integrity, evidence, and compassion. In the end, Macchiarini's story closes not with triumph, but with disgrace. The surgeon once celebrated as a trailblazer now sits as a convicted criminal. The patients who trusted him are gone, their families left with grief that no verdict can erase. The institutions that supported him are still rebuilding their credibility. And the medical world has been left with a hard but vital lesson. When ambition outweighs ethics, the cost is measured in human lives.